What I'm going to talk about today is a phenomenon that I have been following for some time, which you heard about, and that is, we used to talk about Islam as being over there, Muslims over there, and that's how the academy used to study Islam. And then Islam came to North America, and they formed organizations that sort of tried to replicate what's over there. Then they decided, no, we're going to stay here, and so they became Muslims of North America. And tomorrow night I'm going to talk about the American Muslims, the North American Muslims, but because what we have now is a new generation that identifies with North America. And with each generation, with each event, there is change that is taking place in the community. Now, if we look back at the North American engagement with Islam, you will see that in the United States, for example, we can look back and see that the earliest immigrants who came to the US, the Pilgrims, brought with them a Christianity that believed in the Antichrist is coming at the end of time. And the Antichrist... Yeah. Thank you. I was just trying to see. Thank you.
There we go.
And the Antichrist was identified as the Caliph, the Sultan of Turkey, or the Pope, and sometimes both of them together. This is very interesting because right now there is this great fear of Muslims creating a caliphate, and that would be the end of time. That would be the realization of the end of time, because that would be the bringing back of the Antichrist. But also what is very interesting is that when America was founded by the immigrants, it was very anti-Catholic. And today, if you look at the Supreme Court of the United States, you will see that 6 out of 9 Supreme Court justices are Catholic, and not a single Protestant. So sometimes we ask, is it possible that one day there will be one Muslim on the Supreme Court? And everybody says, never. Maybe 6 Muslims on the Supreme Court? Oh, that would be the end of America. So the question is, America is always changing, and it is being formed and reformed by the immigrants that come in as they integrate and assimilate and become part of the society. When they vote, when they participate in the political process, they change the system. And as long as Muslims opted out of participation in the political system, they had little say. But starting with the 1990s, at least in the United States, they became quite engaged in the political system and have been able to have some influence in changing the system and in working to make sure that Islamophobia doesn't take over completely. Now, when you talk about women in the West, we're talking about 3 things that my mother always told me never to talk about. 3 topics: politics, religion, and sex. Those are banned. Now, when we talk about Muslim women, we're talking about all 3 in some way or another. Because Muslim women are part of the encounter of Islam with the West. It goes back to the Crusades. During the Crusades, we have references in which the Crusaders, when they went around, they saw Muslim women and said, oh, these poor things. Their husbands mistreat them, they cover them all up, they're all bundled. And the Muslims looked at the women who were with the Crusaders and said, poor things. They allow strange men to kiss their wives, they allow them to expose themselves. So the cultural encounter, right from the beginning, has been one in which each group othered and the other and said, we are different. And that is something that continues still today. The sort of amalgamation of culture and religion, in which both groups begin to identify that Christianity is this and Islam is this. I remember once reading a letter that was written by a missionary from Kuwait. She had attended a wedding in Kuwait, and she said, I told them that in Christianity, this is what we do for a wedding. It was very interesting to me because I'm Christian, I come from the Middle East. We do it a different way. But for her, it was not Christian because it did not follow the cultural patterns of North America. And that you find in a lot of missionary activity and in the colonial encounter. And for example, we had Lord Cromer writing and saying, oh, these Muslims, you know, they mistreat their women. But when you look and see what club he belonged to when he was in Britain, he belonged to a club that discriminated against women, was against women's voting. But he wanted to change the women of Egypt because he didn't approve of the way they were. In the United States, we look at the history and see that in the literature, for example, the Marine Band song is based on the war against Tripoli. Now we're back in Tripoli again, in Libya. But that's the first war the United States engaged in, as it became a country when it sort of separated from Britain. So the first country that recognized the United States was Morocco. The first war that the United States engaged in was in North Africa against what was called the Barbary states. So what you have is a long history in which they are looking at the Muslim countries as the other. But if you look at the literature that justified the war for the Barbary states, it was to save the women. So it is this idea that the poor Muslim women are so oppressed, and usually you will see there are novels that were written at the time. We show that, you know, this white man going to save these women from these dark, evil men of North Africa. And that kind of chivalrous activity is connected to engagement in war against these areas. When 2001, when we had the attack on the World Trade Towers, First Lady Laura Bush said, "The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women." So we went into Afghanistan to fight for the liberation of women. And the American press just hopped right back and said the exact same thing. So that Chris Matthews said on MSNBC, "They hate us because our culture teaches us to respect women." Now, if you look at Muslim people, they would think that American culture does not respect women, because the respect is in the eye of the beholder, and we have different patterns of what is considered respect. So during the last 2 centuries, where American and European encounter with the Muslim communities in the Middle East was very intimate, there is this effort to change the Muslim women. And you find it in the writings, as I said, of colonial authors, but also the missionaries. We have some of the writings of, for example, Zwemer, and he, in 1926, it was right after the First World War, the Middle East was divided into little sections. They had a meeting of the International Missionary Association in Cairo, and they decided we are going to Islamize the world by the year 2000. And one of the lectures he gave says that from now on we're not going to try and convert the men, we're going to teach the women, because then they are the easier group to convert. And he listed different ways in which you approach a woman in order to convert her. What I found very interesting is that in the 1980s, the Muslim Student Association of North America published a list on how to convert how to do dawah in North America, how to convert people. And they specified women are the easier ones to convert. And they listed almost the identical terms of how to convert women. So that these groups read each other and listen to each other and learn from each other. But what they're saying in all this literature, whether it's the Muslim Student Association or the missionaries, whether they're American or Canadian or Irish or whatever, is that the weaker point in which you can engage with another culture is through the women. And there was a French priest who said that once our nuns teach Muslim women, they will never obey their husband. They will always be sort of resisting the pressure of the husband. So that they all saw themselves as changing the society. The question is in that process a conspiracy to take away Islam? When you talk about liberating women, are you're liberating them from the husband, from the culture, or from the religion? And so what you have is responses to these activities by various Muslim groups throughout the last 2 centuries. And what I'm going to focus on tonight in a specific way is the Muslim Brotherhood. Because the Muslim Brotherhood has changed its attitude towards women and its writings about the role and activities of women. And the reason I'm doing it is because, I don't know about you here in Canada, I will find out in the next 2 days when I visit my brother and sister in Toronto. But in the United States, there's paranoia at the moment that Egypt is going to be taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood, that Tunisia will be taken over by Ghannouchi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and that the whole Middle East is going to become an Islamic fundamentalist, terrorist, essentialist group, even though the young people that are rebelling because they want democracy and they want change. So I want to talk about the role of women as the Muslim Brotherhood has developed it. But in order to look at it, you must also look at how Muslim people overseas have watched how America depicts Muslim women. Probably one of the best ways to look at it is the Hollywood movies. There is one Muslim woman that was a student at Georgetown. She went and put together a little video. It's called Hollywood Harems. And it's sort of clips from various movies that show how women in Islam were depicted. And it was all orgies, and men peeking, and women lounging, and half naked. And what it was is a depiction of how they imagined women to be. If you look at, there was another Arab American woman who wrote her thesis and then published it as a book at the National Geographic. Looked at the National Geographic magazine, and what she found there was that they depicted women in a specific way. So that 1 month they will have, this is a woman from Palestine. A couple of months later, the same woman is dressed in a different dress. This is from Morocco. And what they did is they also had Muslim women who were topless. Now, anybody who has been in a Muslim country knows Muslim women don't go topless, right? But they depicted them that way because at that time in North America, you couldn't show topless women unless they were those other things over there. So in a sense, what she says is the National Geographic magazine was sort of the penthouse of the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. I looked at a book that National Geographic magazine published in 2002. And it talked about 100 years of reporting about Islam. It's called The World of Islam. It's fascinating because it starts with a picture of Afghanistan at war and ends with a picture of Afghanistan at war because, we know Muslims are always fighting. And in between, there are 16 pictures of Muslim women. I thought it was very fascinating because There is nowhere in any of these pictures any reference to the fact that there are Muslim women who have been head of state. For example, we've had women head of state in Indonesia, in Turkey, in Pakistan, and 2 different women who sort of take over Bangladesh and trade places. There is no reference to any of them. They're all covered, huddled, absent the other. And when American Muslims look at this stuff, do they see themselves? No. And that's why they don't see even their relatives that they left behind, because it is a special lens that looks at Muslim women in a particular way. Now, Professor Namat Hafiz Barazangi has made a list of how she has experienced Americans and how they ask her about herself, and listed the sort of various stereotypes that have changed over the years. For example, she says in 1960, in the 60s when she emigrated, the question that they asked her was, you poor women who are all illiterate. Muslims over there, all illiterate. 70s, oh, you're all subject to polygamy and divorce. 80s, you're forced into seclusion. 90s, you cannot drive. 2000, you are stoned and beaten in the streets. And then, of course, there was this great writing for a while. It was fashionable to write about genital mutilation and honor killing. And whatever it is, it's the othering of the Muslim people. My experience is different. When we emigrated to the United States in 1963, in 1968, my husband was teaching at Princeton. I went with some faculty wives to a museum in Philadelphia. And a woman next to me said, you have an accent, where are you from? I said, Jordan. She said, Georgia? No, Jordan. Oh, King Hussein, Lawrence of Arabia. I'm riding on a camel in the desert. And then she turned to me and said, whoever civilized, you did a very good job, quote unquote. Okay? I was stunned because I didn't know what to say. Later on, I thought of various things I could have said, but at that moment, I didn't say anything. But it was this idea that everybody came out of the desert. This stereotype shifted. In the 1970s, after the oil boycott, you would see cartoons in which the Arabs and the Muslims were depicted as though each one of them had an oil derrick in their backyard. They would be marching with 4 wives behind them, and they were all stealing the money from America. By the 80s, the sort of stereotype shifted because they became the terrorists. And if you look at the cartoons, there are always these terrorists. They're killing people over there. Sort of we're worried about it, but really not too much. Except for Vice President Ford, who was very engaged in saying that all Muslims and Arabs in the United States were Chinese spies. And they sort of had Operation Boulder, in which to check on every one of them to see if they were planning to have any terrorism here. But basically, it was over there. Then in the 90s, the Muslims became the enemy. By 2001, they became evil, you know, the evil empire. So the enemy is somebody, you know, you can fight for a while, you can make a peace treaty with, you might even marry their daughter. It's an enemy, you know, you can always make up. Evil is something really, really going to the heart of things. Every religion in the world says you have to eradicate evil. And so this stereotype is really something we have to think about very carefully. As long as we continue to think of Islam and Muslims as evil, we are going to always think that it's something that has to be eradicated in order to bring about good. And so to me, that stereotype is one that I fear more than anything else.